Hi, everybody.
Hello. I'm starting.
Well, good morning, fellow gardeners. It's a rainy morning here in Roseville, but a great time to learn all about tomatoes. I'd like to welcome you to Totally Tomatoes, a workshop presented by the Master Gardeners of Placer County. My name is Sandy Patrick, and I will be the moderator today. As you saw on the opening slides, this workshop is being recorded, and it'll be available on our website via YouTube after it's uploaded. The link to the video and any of the accompanying resources you hear about today can be found at pcmg.ucanr.org. And if you missed that, I'll repeat it at the end. If you have questions during today's talk, please post them to the chat menu, and our presenter will answer them at the end of the remarks. But there are several master gardeners on this call as well, and they may answer a question that you have put into the chat. You will know that your answer is from a master gardener if you see the initials MG after their name. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Master Gardener David Warman, who's going to share a whole lot of information so we can all successfully grow tomatoes in our summer garden. David, take it away.
Thanks a lot, Sandy, and really appreciate everybody coming on this morning. It's a little wet and rainy down here in California, but right now is the perfect time to start planning your tomato strategy for this year. I love giving this talk, one reason because tomatoes are the favorite thing for me to grow, and you can see this picture here. You can see how lovely they are and how wonderful they are. And it's really not hard to grow tomatoes and maybe impress your neighbors, your family and friends. So we want to share some ideas today on how to do that. But let me also, before I start, I want to let everyone know who the Master Gardeners of Placer County are. We're part of the UC system, and University of California. We extend research-based sustainable gardening and composting information, and we try and give accurate and impartial information to home gardeners. So we try and encourage the public to make informed gardening decisions. And we also, we're a volunteer group. You can reach us. We have an ongoing hotline, which is really fun. I man that sometimes. You can reach us at this number, 530-889-7388. We have a website. We're very active on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We have some publications that go out in some of the local media around the Placer County area. I would also encourage you to sign up for a quarterly newsletter that we have, which is called The Curious Gardener. And that's got a lot of really good information in it. It's free. You just sign up, put your email address on our website, and we'll be sending you that every quarter. And then the other thing we do to kind of keep the doors open, we have a gardening guide and calendar, which we sell, which gives you tips on what to do in your garden at various times of the year. It's something that's available generally in the fall. Right now, we're pretty much sold out of it, but next fall you can look for it on our website or at one of our vendors. And we also have a very active school and community gardening group also. And before I start the presentation, I want to let everyone know that on the website, there's a link to several handouts, which has got a lot of the information that we're going to be sharing today on there. So you can click on that, you can download them and print them off. And again, you'll have some great information. Well, let's go ahead and start talking about tomatoes. One thing about tomatoes, that it's kind of important to know the family of plants that tomatoes is a part of. And that would be the nightshade families. And peppers, potatoes, and eggplants are also in that family. The reason it's important to know the family of the plants that you're planting in your garden, later on when we talk about crop rotation, when you get into a crop rotation program and you develop a strategy over a multi-year period to alternate your crops in different parts of your garden, you want to do it you want to alternate the whole nightshade family, not just tomatoes. You want to don't plant peppers in the place you put in your rotation system with tomatoes as an example. But the tomato actually is originated in South America. So it is one of the few fruits and vegetables that originated here right in the Americas, but happened to be South America. It was originally known as the love apple, and it was originally thought to be poisonous. And just as a note, it actually is an edible fruit, although it's labeled as a vegetable. So we see that it originated in Peru and then went up to Central America, over to Europe, and didn't come into the North America until the 18th century. Wasn't widely accepted as we mentioned before, but it did gain acceptance. And one of the reasons, because there was additional hybrids and some different types of tomatoes that are just delicious. And that's really the fun thing about tomatoes is you can develop a lot of different varieties and have a lot of different flavors and tastes. So if we look at a tomato plant and the flower, actually, the flower has got both male and female parts. So it's a fully can reproduce on its own. Generally, it reproduces. It will reproduce on what they call buzz pollination, or movement of air will move the pollen down and it will be fertilized. You can see the fruit of the tomato. There's a cross section of the fruit, and you'll notice, and I'm sure you've all seen this, but inside the fruit you've got the seeds. And when we get to the seed saving part of the discussion, this is the area that you would scoop out and you would separate the seeds from this gelatinous material that's in there. But that's a cross section of the tomato. And also you can see this is a stem of a tomato. And if you've ever walked through and rubbed against a tomato, you kind of come out of you come in contact with these glandular hairs, and what happens is they give off an odor, and it's kind of a characteristic odor. Personally, I don't think it's too offensive, but it's not something you want either. But that's just about the tomato. So let's talk about different types of tomatoes. There's open pollinated or standard. The main two different varieties we have are different types of tomatoes. We have heirloom tomatoes, which are always open pollinated. Heirloom tomatoes are traditionally introduced more than 50 years ago, and a lot of them have a real history on their own. Heirloom tomatoes are the older varieties. I love growing them. And sometimes they can be a little more challenging because they're not as disease resistant and they may have some other issues, but they're actually wonderful to grow. Heirlooms. Also, if you save seed, saving seed from heirlooms is a viable thing to do because you're going to get the same seed from that same plant every year. Now, if you have a hybrid, which are very popular also, if you have a hybrid tomato, it's crossbred by human intervention. And basically what that means is you've got two different parents that came together and were bred for specific purposes. Some of those purposes might be taste. Some of the purposes of interbreeding and hybrid breeding would be disease resistance, taste, size of the fruit, color of the fruit. So there are a lot of different reasons why they use hybrids. And hybrids are great, but the one thing about hybrids, if you're a person that likes to save seeds, if you save seeds from a hybrid plant, you're not going to plant that seed next year and expect to see the same plant you had, because that seed is actually going to be just from one of the parents, not the actual hybrid. So saving seeds would traditionally be done more with an heirloom tomato. This is a matter of interest. Now, tomatoes, this is my record, was 2.1 pounds, and I had this wonderful sandwich from it. But actually, I think the world record came out of Washington, if I'm not mistaken, was 7 pounds, 12 ounces. So they can get quite large. And obviously, you also know there's also some cherry tomatoes in all the different sizes, but I'm kind of impressed by my record, and that was several years ago. So when we talk about open versus hybrid pollination, you can see that in the standard pollination, the pollen grains would be released by and fall down and float down into the stigma, and they would fertilize the flower. In a hybrid, a person would actually fertilize it mechanically, and they would create a hybrid in that situation. And there's a lot of hybrids that are recommended in this area, but those are the two different types. The other types of tomato we have are determinate and indeterminate. An indeterminate tomato is a tomato that the terminal bud of an indeterminate tomato does not set fruit, and therefore it just keeps growing. These are very popular. They will grow quite large. Actually, we grow tomatoes as an annual in our climates here in North America, primarily because they all die off in the frost. But if you had a tomato plant in a perfect environment, which would be in the temperatures between 65 and 90 degrees, they will just keep growing. So an indeterminate tomato will just keep growing off and keep producing fruit. So they traditionally produce fruit over a longer period of time in the year, and then they'll die off obviously when we get some frost. As an interesting note, some greenhouse production tomatoes, which are located all through North America and even into Canada, they grow these indeterminate tomatoes, and they'll grow them up vines, and they'll get quite extensive plant growth, and they'll grow them for quite a long time, over a year. So that's an indeterminate tomato, and the seeds will be noted on that, what it is. A determinate tomato is one that traditionally grows to a certain size. The terminal buds do not set fruit, so it grows to a certain size and then produces fruit. A lot of your varieties of tomatoes that are determinate are canning tomatoes, because it's really convenient to have all of your tomatoes come into bear fruit at the same time, so you can harvest them, and you can actually harvest them and can them, or make some sauce out of them, that kind of thing. A lot of times Determinate tomatoes. I generally cage all my tomatoes, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but sometimes some people, if they got a small determinate, you won't even need to put a stake or a cage around it, but that's kind of a personal choice. I like to actually stake or cage most all of my tomatoes. So there's a couple different ways of going. One, you can start from seed, or you can start with transplants, and we'll talk about that. If you're starting from seed, you need to work backwards from your anticipated planting date. And your anticipated planting date, if you're going to use a calendar system in our area, probably May 1st would be a good date, but you really, it's based on soil temperature. When your soil temperature is 65 degrees, that's when you can plant. And a 65-degree soil temperature, and when your nighttime temperatures are 50 degrees, then that would be a good time to plant. In our area here in California, it would be May 1st would be a good gauge. It could be a little earlier than that, just a little bit later. If you're someone up in Oregon, then you would actually be planting later than that, because your soil temperatures would be a little cooler up there. So you want to start using seed mix, not potting soil. You want to use a seed mix. Generally, that's a sterilized seed mix, which prevents, if it's a sterile mix, then you can prevent some potential for disease to come in. You want to moisten the soil and gently tamp. And I'm going to go through these steps, and I'm going to show you some pictures on that. You want to moisten the soils and gently tap it. You want to place the seeds in cells, blocks, or open flats. Cover lightly and read the seed package label. And we'll look at some of those also. Most of the seed package labels will tell you to plant them at about 1/4 of an inch. And then you want to also provide warmth. And you can do that by you obviously are doing this inside where it's warmer, and you can actually put a heating mat underneath the flat if you want to provide a little more warmth, and you'll stimulate the growth a little bit more. You want to cover the dome with plastic or a dome to retain moisture. And I say this every year, you want to keep a log of what you plant. I say that every year. My wife and I actually we say this, but we don't do it as well as we say it, because our log is not as accurate as we need to make it. And we're actually turned over a new leaf, and this year we're going to keep an accurate log of what we plant, where we plant it, when it was planted, so we have an understanding of when it's going to become ready for harvest, etc. And when you're doing this, work slowly and carefully. So let's look at some pictures here. Now, when you buy these seed packets, there's a lot of information on these seed packets. First of all, you'll note that it's got a real catchy name up here that I can't pronounce too well, but Costoludo Genevieve. And it's actually a heirloom seed. So this tells you that this seed has been around for over 50 years, and it's an heirloom variety, and it's probably, it's got some really unique characteristics. All of the seed packets will also have a lot of other information, and they've got planting instructions. They got a description of what the plant is. They've got, and I'm going to go down to another slide here, I believe, which has got a little bit more detail here. But this would be a hybrid seed. As you can see, it's clearly marked as a hybrid. It's got a name on it. Again, it's a catchy name because they're all fun to plant. And this, as you can see, this information on here has got the seed depth. You want to take note of what the plant spacing is. So that plant spacing is when you go to move this seedling, this plant out into your garden, you want to know what your spacing is and your row spacing. And you're going to also want to take note of when this tomato variety sprouts, and in this case 7 to 15 days, and a lot of that might be dependent on the temperature it's growing at and that kind of thing. So if you're going to plant this in your garden and you knew it sprouts in 7 to 15 days, you knew that your target to plant would be May 1st, you need to start this 2 or 3 weeks earlier to get this up to a point where you can actually transplant it on May 1st. And this maturity date, actually most seeds, that's a maturity date when you plant it as a transplant in the ground. So if you planted this on May 1st, it's going to mature in 78 days. And it's got a seed count also on there. And then also you'll see most of these seed packets, or all of them, are by law are going to be required to have a sell by date and generally what they try and do is they want to get really high germination rate. So they have a sell by date. If you save the seed till next year, this one says it's sell by 2/12/20. That seed would still probably be good. It probably just wouldn't have as high a germination rate as it would if it was, say, last year, because I think this is a seed packet from last year. But even a year-old seed will actually be fine. So that's the seed packet. Now, I also suggest that you save these seed packets, because you save it and you can save it in your log, but you can also, it lets you know when this plant, there's a lot of information on the plant about when it's going to mature and that kind of thing. And you'll want to know that information later on as you move forward. So as you start with seed, you notice you cover it with plastic. You can keep moisture in there. And you've got these big trays and they're being heated. And again, this is a different method here with some different cells you can use. You're going to see they started to sprout, and you're going to want to put light on them after they emerge. You're going to want to put light on them. And once they've started to sprout, you want to remove the dome, and you do that to prevent damping off. Damping off is a disease that, even though you're using sterile soil, which would not have the disease there, and actually damping off is a disease that can move in water, and it's a phytophthora disease. It can be a problem, and if you overwater it, and it can be a problem, and your plant will die. You want to provide 12 hours of light if possible, and you can generally do that obviously if you're doing this indoors with a controlled light situation. You want to fertilize probably with a liquid fertilizer after the first true leaves appear. And what you want to do also, you want to probably take your smaller trays, and you want to pot up to like a 4-inch pot to avoid any root binding. And that will give you what looks like a transplant that you would buy at a store at that point. So you want to maintain proper moisture. And that's, not too dry, not too wet. There's a balance there. And as you develop your skills, you kind of understand what that is, but that's something you need to maintain. So as you see, they started to sprout, and they're quite large plants. And then we got a planting out strategy. And basically there's several things we need to do. One is hardening off, and we'll explain what that is. We want to prepare the bed with compost and soil mixtures. We want to plan our spacing. We want to look at what what we call something called deep planting, which is a strategy that works really well. You want to plan some kind of support structure. You want to mulch. You want to have a method of watering and irrigation. There's fertilizing and pruning strategies also with tomatoes. So let's talk just a little bit about fertilizer. Most of the time when you use your starts, you've used some fertilizer when you are growing your seeds, and you want to use a fertilizer also after the flowering. You want to also, when they're in the ground, you're going to want to use some fertilizer. There's organic, less toxic solutions, which generally are from natural sources. There's conventional materials, which are chemical based and really just mined nutrients. And if you look down here, these N, P, and K, when you see these 3 numbers here, that's nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Those are marked on most all fertilizers will be listed, the percentages. So and they're all different. And what you want to do is read and follow the label instructions on your fertilizer. A lot of times fertilizers also have a micronutrient package, which are some micronutrients that are specific to that particular vegetable you're growing. So like this is a vegetable and tomato food, they would have micronutrients that the tomato needs. Some of the considerations with fertilization. So, we've used starter fertilizer at planting. So after blossoming, you want to use a good organic fertilizer every 2 to 3 weeks. However, you do not want to over-fertilize, especially with nitrogen, because if you have too much nitrogen, you can actually create too much vegetative growth. And if you have too much vegetative growth, you're not going to produce as much fruit because it's going to be pushing vegetative growth versus fruit growth. And if you want to use compost, which is a really good source, some compost you have, or side dress with a really low nitrogen, like a 5-10-10 commercial fertilizer, that would be a good idea. So as we start, we get our transplants ready, then what we do is we start the hardening off process. Hardening off really means is what you're doing is you've grown this plant inside, and this plant inside, maybe your laundry room or possibly your kitchen, is not used to any outdoor temperatures that are low. So what you want to do is acclimate that tomato plant, or the start that you've grown, you want to acclimate it to the outside temperatures, which are going to be lower. So you start slowly. The first day you set outside in the shade next to the house, and then you bring them in at night. You might set it out for 4 or 5 hours the first day. You want to raise the exposure gradually and monitor your seedlings. And then you can finally leave them outside when the overnight temperature is predicted to be 50 degrees or higher, Fahrenheit higher. So that's when you would harden them off. For some reason, there we go. So for a second, my screen got caught there and I just had a slight panic. As we prepare the bed, now this is a bed that I prepared for tomatoes, and you can see that what I did, actually, I came in with a fork and I kind of worked the soil because I'm trying to go in a no-till situation, but then I added in some additional soil, and I have raised, because a lot of times in raised beds, if you're using raised beds, you have a lot of decomposition, so you need to add some soil as you move forward. And then I've also got I've got a tomato cage in here. You can see this little green structure here, but with any raised bed, you're going to want to add soil, and now's a good time to do that because it's right around the corner. Now, the other thing, we talked about planting deep, and this is a transplant. This is my wife. She's actually taking this transplant. She's going to plant it. We have a strategy we call planting deep. And that's what that entails is you take your transplant, and of course they generally come with a tag here. Then you can save this tag, and you can either put it in your logbook or you can stick it in the ground next to your tomato to understand what the plant is later on. But what you want to do is prune off some of these lower branches. So you can see she's pruning off these lower branches. And so she's preparing to plant this deep. And what you do is you dig and this is in a pot, which brings up the consideration that tomatoes can not only be grown in a garden, but they can actually be grown successfully in a pot. So even someone in an apartment complex that's got a deck or some kind of an outdoor area, they can actually grow tomatoes and enjoy the tomatoes. So you plant it deep, and the reason you're planting it deep is because what happens is, and there's two strategies. One, you can put it. We recommend actually putting it at an angle, and the reason for that is along this stem, you're going to get root growth. Roots are going to grow out of there. And it provides a really big foundation of roots for the tomato to grow. And if the bigger mass of roots you have, the better off your tomato is going to be as it enters the summer and you get into these hot, stressful periods. So if you've got a good root system, you can also actually just plant that straight down. Some people do that, but honestly, I like to turn mine on its side. So that's what we call deep planting. And here's an example of one that was deep planted, that one in a pot. And it's going to be growing pretty rapidly as we move forward. And we talked about spacing. Remember on that seed packet, we've got information on how far apart they should be and what kind of spacing you want to use. Generally, for an indeterminate tomato, which one that, the larger tomato type, you need at least 3 foot by 3 foot to grow the tomato. Some of the smaller determinate varieties, you might not need quite so much. So you need to, effectively plan that as you move forward. You're going to need some kind of support trellis. A lot of times you'll note this is an example. There's many different kinds of support trellises or cages. This is an example of cages. You can see here, and they're not easily to see here, but there are cages in here. Traditionally, they're smaller at the bottom, and then they get larger as they move up. Now, one tip on these cages, and the one reason why this gentleman's probably got these stakes here, is you want to give these cages some support also. These cages, actually, as the tomato plant grows and they bear a lot of fruit, there's a lot of weight, believe it or not, on these tomatoes. So if you don't have them soundly, firmly attached to like a stake, sometimes they can fall down. That happened at my mother-in-law's last summer, where we had 3 tomatoes growing, and actually she had fantastic tomatoes, but one of them fell down because we didn't actually put any stakes there. I mean, the plant got too big, and it was kind of a problem. So I'd really recommend staking these things. Another strategy you can involve, and this is with an indeterminate variety that keeps growing, you can actually grow tomatoes along a sky wire. And I've seen some really extensive greenhouse situations and some even outdoor areas where someone has grown one along a sky wire, and you can just, it's kind of amazing to see. If you've never seen it, they can get 20 feet long, and you can have fruit all along the tomato. So that's another option. Now, this is anything that provides support or structure for the tomato will be effective. There's many different ways of doing it. There's no right way. A tomato naturally, if you're just going to have a tomato out in the field, it will grow just on the ground. Now, growing on the ground is not a good strategy, because what happens is your fruit touches the ground a lot of times, and you lose a lot of fruit through to disease. So that's not a strategy you want to employ. So this is what we do: is we stake them up, we cage them up, and we grow them that way. Mulch is actually a very effective way to help your tomatoes survive through the summer. You remember the tomatoes like to grow between 65 and 90 degrees. And as most of you know on this call, many times the temperatures in our area get above 90 degrees. So a mulch will help keep the soil temperatures down. It'll help the tomatoes retain moisture that you provide through an irrigation system, traditionally with a drip irrigation in our area. And so I heavily recommend that you mulch your tomatoes. And some of the other considerations that we have in relationship to growing tomatoes, they prefer a soil pH of between 6 and 7. And the best way to find out what your soil pH is, there's a couple different ways. One, you can get a soil pH testing kit like at a garden center. But if you really wanted to get heavily involved in producing a lot of tomatoes, one strategy would be to get a soil test done of your garden or your area where you're going to grow plants at. And that can be done pretty economically. You can have a soil sample taken, you can send it off, and they're going to give you an indication of what the soil pH is. They'll also give you an indication of what your nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and micronutrient levels are in your soil. So we'll give you a good understanding of what you need to do to supplement the nutrients in your soil. So that can be easily done. If you want information on how to do that, you can call our Master Gardener hotline. We've got some really good literature on how to do it. We've got information on where to send it off and get that accomplished. So the other thing you need to do is we mentioned that you need 6 to 8 hours of sunlight. An east to west location and orientation of the bed is really preferred. And the other thing you want to do is avoid a cold microclimate or a cold hot microclimate, so to speak. What's a microclimate? A microclimate might be an area, like as an example where I live, I'm living on a slope that slopes down to a creek that's pretty steep, and down in the creek it's cooler than it is up on top of the hill. That's kind of a microclimate. if you've got a raised bed next to a garage that's got can be a heat source, that might be a microclimate, which is a little bit too hot. So that's something you want to try and avoid. And when we talk about crop rotation, we talked about the tomato being in the nightshade family, along with peppers and potatoes and things like that. A 3-year crop rotation is good. In other words, you don't want to go over that in the same area. And the reason for that is because there's a lot of diseases that grow in the soil naturally, and they're just there. Most of these diseases, or a lot of them anyway, are host specific to different plants. So some of these, we'll talk about some of these diseases as we move forward, but some of these fusarium and verticillium diseases would be specific to all eggplants, tomatoes, peppers, and potatoes. So if you don't plant that family for a year or two in a certain area, you have a good chance of breaking the disease cycle and preventing those diseases from becoming a really serious problem. So we'll talk about that a little bit more as we move forward. And also access to water. You want to make sure you have access to water because you're gonna want to irrigate these things. We mentioned earlier, or I mentioned that you want to try and use drip irrigation, because drip irrigation is going to allow the water to be placed in the area where you want it. And you're going to avoid, if you used an overhead sprinkler as an example, you're going to get moisture on the leaves, which is going to really promote disease on your leaves. So use a drip irrigation, uses less water, and it will also prevent some diseases. Now, pruning your tomatoes, and this is something that I've done, I probably need to do an even better job on, but pruning is not always necessary. However, when you do prune, there's a couple main points. And in the pruning of a tomato is done a lot of times because they get a lot of vegetative growth. And if you cut some of that vegetation out there, it pushes the fruit production. So you can have more fruit. Also, it kind of opens up the canopy of the tomato, so then you have some air movement through there, which helps prevent some of the diseases. So plants with 2 or more stems produce more tomatoes with better foliage protection from the sun than plants with 1 stem. So what you want to do is you don't want to severely prune it, and it's really kind of up to you, because some people don't prune them that much, but severe pruning to 1 stem will reduce your total crop greatly and is also likely to increase the incidence of some diseases and disorders. So, but before you remove suckers or side shoots on a tomato, a lot of times you wait until 2 leaves develop and then pinch them. And here's an explanation of what that means. So you can see this one you can actually prune this out, but if you want to promote more fruit growth, you can actually wait till there's 2 leaves and then prune them, pinch the middle one. And therefore you'll get kind of a nice canopy and have a correct balance between too much foliage and not enough foliage. So let's talk about pests and problems. And we're going to talk about vertebrate pests. We're going to talk about insects. We're going to talk about disease and environmental problems. And then one of the other problems that can be with tomatoes would be weeds. And I didn't have it on here, and I mentioned it to my wife the other day that we've never had a serious weed problem in our tomatoes. I just kind of puzzling look, and she said that's because she's been pulling them. So that's what she's done. Now, the vertebrate pests that are generally a problem in our area, it depends on if you're in the city or if you're out in the country. I kind of live out in the country, so the biggest problem I have is deer. And so we actually use a deer fence, and that's something we have to have or we're not going to garden. Now, also, if you've got a raised bed, another thing you might want to do before you make your raised bed would be to put some wire under it, this like a hard cloth wire, and that will prevent rodents from coming up inside and underneath it. But a lot of times vertebrate pests, really exclusion is where you want to try and target, and keep them out of the area where you're growing. Of course, we have insects. We have the dreaded hornworm they're pretty photogenic, but I guess they're either ugly or beautiful depending on your point of view. Most people in our area, you will see hornworms in your area, and they can actually defoliate a tomato really rapidly. The best strategy to control hornworms is to go out in your garden, to check around. When we find them, grab them off the plant and squish them. That's the best way to go. I mean, there's other ways, but they're not that serious of a problem to where you can't do that. Now, you're going to see some signs of invasion in some of your areas, and you might start getting a little concerned when you see some eggs and you see some insects. There are both, before you use any insecticide, and quite frankly, I haven't used an insecticide on my tomatoes, and I can't remember the last time, because you do have beneficial insects and you have obviously pest insects. You can see this is a wasp that's laid eggs in a hornworm, and that actually lays eggs in there and it will kill the hornworm. So that's working alongside you. So if you just pick these off, they generally are not a problem. The other thing is, we do have some common tomato pests like aphids, thrips, flea beetles, and whiteflies. But you know, traditionally, a lot of times these plants can survive a certain level of infestation. You know, so generally you do not need to make an application. I personally haven't, but you need to kind of monitor it. And if you do have a situation in where you need to make an application, you need to, what we as master gardeners recommend is the natural, less toxic insecticides. Like for aphids as an example, we recommend insecticidal soap or a neem oil extract, and that will a lot of times help you out. Now, if you want to make an application for fruit worms or hornworms, there's some organically certified materials like Bacillus thuringiensis, which is a naturally occurring bacteria. There's a spinosad material, a pyrethrum, or a neem extract oil. Again, a lot of times I think with hornworms, especially, just picking them off is going to be a sound strategy. Flea beetles is kind of the same strategy, the insecticidal soap, neem oil extract, horticultural oil, pyrethrum, and then whiteflies, the same strategy. So you do have some options if you have problems, but I would monitor them. And we use like an integrated pest management strategy, which, you know, between hand picking and monitoring and making sure that you don't have a real big outbreak, you probably don't need to use these things. Now let's look at tomato diseases. There's several different kind of tomato diseases that we look at. There's bacterial, fungal, and viral and environmental disorders actually that we refer to. Now, the list of tomato diseases is a little bit daunting when you look at this, and this is what professional growers face when they're growing things. But let's kind of get it down to the diseases that are kind of a problem in our area that we have. That would be the verticillium and fusarium wilt, tobacco mosaic virus, or TMV would be another one. Damping off, which is either a Pythium or a Phytophthora type disease. Powdery mildew, blossom end rot, and sun scald. Now, so as we talk about controlling the diseases, I want to say that, again, with diseases, there's a lot of integrated pest management strategies we use. Like as an example, with verticillium wilt and fusarium wilt. These are very, very difficult diseases to control. In fact, there's very few methods of actually controlling them, even professionally. They're very difficult to control. They're soil-borne diseases. If they're in the soil, they're going to be there. The strategy we use for these is use resistant plant varieties if you've got this, or even better, if you use crop rotation, you can prevent those from becoming a problem. But these three diseases are very devastating, but they also have resistant varieties that you can use and not have a problem with this. And the other thing that I would recommend here, that we make a note down here of removing debris. So removing debris from your garden is a really critical thing to prevent these diseases from overwintering. If last fall, if you would have went in your garden, in which I'm sure all of you did, and you cleaned out your garden so it's clean and there's no debris there, that disease, and a lot of times, won't have the opportunity to overwinter. So you're going to prevent that from becoming a problem. So that's a good thing. Damping off, Damping off is, as we mentioned, is a phytophthora. The spores are generally in the soil. A lot of times they're there, and it's a question of, is this a problem? Is if you overwater, it becomes a problem. So if you don't overwater, it probably will not become a problem. So that's what you got to monitor is your irrigation. Now, one of the diseases that invariably I will see almost every year in my garden is powdery mildew. And if you look at this disease, this is a really good example where a plant, and I had some plants that got it last year. I did nothing to them. I did not make any application of any fungicides of any type, just because I knew that the plant really wasn't being affected that much. And it was a situation where the disease infestation wasn't that great. However, the best way is to cure is to try and prevent this from being a problem. So if you have good air circulation, and this is where we get back and we talk about pruning strategically to get some airflow through your plant. If you do that, you try and have dry leaves by using drip irrigation, you get a nice full sun. There are some disease resistant varieties also. You can prevent this from becoming a problem. This will affect not only tomatoes, but also squash and things like that. If you do have a problem and you want to make an application, there are some materials like some natural oils. You can use sulfur, which is an organically certified material. It's a natural, sulfur is natural. Or you can use a product like Serenade, which is Serenade is a bacteria, it's a Bacillus subtilis material. Basically, it's a naturally occurring bacteria that's fermented and it can be used effectively to control powdery mildew, and it's organically certified. So those are some of your suggested solutions for that. Now, when we talk about resistant varieties, when you're buying your seed pack, a lot of times it's going to have, like this one says Roma, V, F, N. What that means is, and you look down here on the back page, or look in your literature that that I give you here, you know that if it says VFM, that means it's resistant to verticillium wilt, it's resistant to fusarium, and it's resistant to nematodes also. And also, it probably in the back page here, it says it's resistant to TMV, also tobacco mosaic virus. You might also see where it says F and then it says FF, or it might say FFF. And what that means is, because fusarium is a very devastating disease, it's actually mutated several times. I think there's at least four different strains of fusarium in the state of California now, and they call them races, like race 1, race 2, race 3. So if it says F, it's resistant to the race 1, which is the most prevalent. If it says FF, that would be race 2, and so on. FFF would be race 3. So it gets a little complicated, but using these resistant varieties, these hybrids in areas where you might have a disease problem, they're really good strategies. So one of the other things you might get is blossom end rot, and almost everybody that grows tomatoes eventually sees blossom end rot. Don't freak out. It happens. It's unsightly. Blossom end rot actually is a result of low calcium in the fruit. So that's what it is. It's a result of low calcium in the fruit. Now, some people think that, well, maybe that's because I don't have enough calcium in my soil. That may be the case, but more times out of not is the fact that what happens is the calcium's not available to your plant because of the watering balance was not right. And the watering dried out and got wet. The water balance wasn't correct. So most times it's a water balance issue and it's associated with your irrigation. And if you do get one or two of these fruit that have the blossom end rot and you adjust your irrigation, you can generally correct the problem. So that's something you'll see, but it's something you can overcome pretty easily. The other thing you're going to see is sun scald, and this is like a sunburn, just like if a human got, sunburned. When the temperatures go up really high, and we indicated earlier, temperatures like the tomatoes like temperatures between 65 and 90 degrees. So when temperatures go up to 90 and they get extended periods where they get really hot weather, maybe even in the area, Sacramento area, we get temperatures over 100 degrees. To prevent sun scald, you need to develop some kind of strategy to get some shade on your tomato to bring the temperature down. And that's the way to prevent that. But typically, especially like this last year when we had some hot weather, I saw some sun scald there, and you'll probably see some of that. But that's what that is. Now let's talk about saving seeds a little bit. We talked about heirloom seeds are a good thing you can try and save seeds on. In the handouts, there's a bulletin on saving seeds. But if you remember, the seeds you want to save would probably be the heirloom seeds, because the heirloom seeds are the ones that are going to reproduce the same plant you had the year before. So if you're trying to save hybrid seeds, you're just rolling dice on what you're going to get, because you don't know what the plant is going to be next year. So if you get some of those heirloom seeds and you cut them open, you actually kind of want to pick some plants that are really healthy plants, let the fruit get almost overripe. And then you want to bring them in and you want to scoop out that gelatinous mix and then put it in some water, and then you let it ferment. And then what happens is this fermentation will kind of rise and the seeds go to the bottom of the water. And then you want to take the fermented material off the top, and it doesn't smell too good either. So you have to understand that. And then you want to spread your seeds out and dry them and store them in a safe, dry place. So there's instructions on how to do that in some of the handouts. If you want to save seeds, want to save them in a cool, dry place would be a good strategy. So, when we talk about, and we didn't really get into this in this presentation because there's a lot of different varieties out there. I've grown some of these Brandywine, these San Marino, the Sun Gold cherry tomatoes. They're outstanding. There's really a large number of different tomatoes you can get. Mortgage Lifter was one of my favorites. And there's different colors and it's kind of fun. Actually, they have different flavors. Why we like to grow them? Because they're beautiful. They're really, you can impress your neighbors and your family with a volume of tomatoes. If you get really good at it, you can just be pulling a lot of tomatoes off. And one thing you can do with them, what we did, my cousin and her husband and I and our family, we got together and we canned last year, and we're enjoying these tomatoes all year. And we did a count last time, my wife and I did. We looked at it. We probably have enough to get us to about July. So we're going to be looking for some more tomatoes certainly by then. But we have a lot of tomato sauce, so we really enjoy that. Now, here's some of the handouts that we've got. This Tomatoes in the Home Garden is written actually specifically here in Placer County by our county extension agent, our director, Cindy Fake. And it's got a lot of good information here on tomatoes in our area. I would highly recommend that you print this off. It's got recommendations on different varieties. And there's another one that's written also locally. It's written by one of our other colleagues at the University of California. And again, a lot of good information on what we've talked about here and some of the problems you might incur and how to solve those. And then also we have some information on how to harvest seed from the garden and how to handle that through the year. So and also this presentation is available online. You can print it off. You might wait till tomorrow because actually I changed the presentation that's on there now a little bit. So the actual presentation is just a couple slides difference, but we're going to be updating the new presentation here in the next 24 hours or so. So with that, I'm going to ask if there's any questions, and I really appreciate everybody coming on the meeting today. It's been fun. It's exciting that we're going to come into a tomato season soon, and we're all going to be enjoying these things. And maybe even next year, instead of these Zoom meetings, we can have a meeting in person. We can all talk about our tomato successes. That will be fun. So I'm going to turn it back to Sandy now and see if we have any questions.
Oh gosh, David, yeah, meeting in person would sure be fun. That was great. That was so much information. Oops, I've got one more question to grab. And I want to tell you that you were so totally tomatoes that now you have a lot of questions. So here's
Okay.
question number one.
I hope I can
Question
answer
number
them.
one from Denise, and you might have answered this, but I wanted to see if you had any more to add. Denise wants to know when it's time to start planting Brad's atomic grape tomato seeds. And I tried to find where she's from, and I don't know. So that's yours.
Well, again, you got to work backwards. I'm not sure where you're from, but you want to work backwards from your anticipated planting date. Your planting date would be when you think that the soil temperature is at 65, and you can generally find that out by the extension agent when traditionally it is. Around our area, May 1st is a really good strategy, and when you want to take your transplant and put it in. So I would say that you want to start probably 2 months before your planting date. You want to start growing your transplant. So that's when I would seed that you're growing the transplant.
Okay, Denise, I hope that answered your question. The next question from Jonna asked about using pine needles as mulch.
That's not something I would recommend. I've never used pine needles as mulch. I wouldn't recommend that. No.
Okay.
I think they might be a little bit too acidic, but that's my thinking. Before I did that, I would really have to do some research on it. But I've never done it. I've never seen a recommendation to do it.
So Kurt or Angie Pearson asked about, he missed what you said about seed packages say 79 days. Is that 79 from the time you start or the time you start the small plants in the garden?
So if it's a 79 or 78 days to maturity, that's when you put it in the garden, when you plant that transplant, that's when day one starts. 78 days after that's when it would be maturity. It would reach maturity. Yeah.
Perfect. We have more questions. Do you feel like you're on Jeopardy?
I'm not sure I'm good enough to go on Jeopardy, so we better watch it.
So the next question from Suda is, what size pot is recommended for container gardening?
Well, for container garden, I would use at least a 15 or 20 gallon pot for a good sized tomato. If you got a smaller determinate tomato, which would be a smaller plant, you can maybe go a little smaller than that, but I go 15 or 20 gallons. Or another way of looking at it, if you have a wine barrel, which are a lot of wine barrels around here, the size of a wine barrel, that would be a good one to put a tomato in. And that's what I've done in some of my areas. So that would be a good enough volume of soil for a good sized tomato plant.
Are you doing okay? Because there are still more questions.
Great. Yeah, I'm good.
Okay, great. So this one is from Jonna, and she wants to know if the cracking or soft spots on tomatoes are caused by disease.
Well, it depends, and that's what we always answer, because soft spot could be disease, but cracking traditionally is due to like an irrigation issue, and possibly drying out, and maybe not even irrigation. Honestly, I just, if they get cracked, I almost look at that like, okay, that one needs to be picked, and I'll eat it, because I eat the cracked ones. It's not a problem, but usually it's an irrigation thing. But if you got soft spots, that could be a disease, yes.
Okay. Well, they're coming fast on the chat, so give me a second to catch up here.
Sure.
So Anita has two questions. The first one is, she was referring to your slide where you showed the wasp on the hornworm, and could a hornworm eat significant amount of the plant before those beneficial wasps do it in?
Yes, it could. Yes. I mean, it's all a balance, right? We're in nature, so there's a balance. And yes, a hornworm can take down eat quite a bit of foliage. So that's why you need to be monitoring your garden, really. But yeah, I mean, but there's a balance, and they help. Let me put it that way. They help, but they're not the final solution. Yeah.
Right. So her second question was a little more specific. She said, I always remove debris, but I'm wondering if 1 or 2 missed leaves alone would be enough to keep a disease going.
Well, I mean, that little bit of that depends. 1 or 2 leaves is not going to really hurt too much. I mean, there's a lot of people that don't take the debris out, but yeah, I mean, 1 or 2 leaves is not going to probably be that big a problem, but it could. I mean, that's where many diseases will overwinter there. Yeah. So you want to try and remove as much as possible is the answer, I guess.
So tomatoes are really popular. There are still more questions. You game?
Yes, I am. Yeah. I mean, yes.
So Charlene says, we've planted tomatoes in the same raised bed for years. I think we must have soil disease. If we remove all the soil, will that substitute for crop rotation and help control the disease?
The answer to that could be yes and no, because you have got soil underneath the bed, right? So that soil underneath the bed, you're not replacing, but you would do, if you did replace all of the soil, that would be a good strategy for crop rotation. But keep in mind, you do have soil underneath there, and the diseases and insects and things move around in what we call the soil web, which is pretty complex. And it includes not just what's in your raised bed, but what's underneath your raised bed too. But if that's what my choice was, if I've grown tomatoes there for a number of years, I would, there's a couple of things you can do. One, you can use, and we didn't really talk about it today, but you can use cover crops, and you can use crops like, you could put a winter crop in your raised bed of like broccoli and cauliflower. Broccoli and cauliflower are actually good rotation because they actually, like broccoli as an example, will emit a natural chemical that's natural, and they'll actually help control some of that disease. So you can use that and replacing soil, and you can kind of get into rotation if that's all you've got. Yeah, that's what you can do. So I guess the answer, it depends.
The famous starting answer.
The famous starting answer for a master gardener.
Yeah. Thank you, David. We're not done yet. Don't go away.
Okay.
So Joe M asked about suggestions for coping with the heat. Thinking of last year's hot summer, I'm sure.
Well, I think the best strategy is number one, if you think about it, you remember when we talked about planting deep, and we talked about getting a foundation of a good root and a good soil. And if you get it, the healthier that plant is going into the heat zone is you're going to be better off. But when you get into these heat zones, I think you really need to think about some strategies, and you have to get a little bit innovative to shade these things. If you get some shade cloth, is really the best way you can dramatically reduce your heat on that plant if you put some shade cloth on it. Mm-hmm. So that's what I would do.
Yeah, great suggestion. That was so important last year to save the plants. Let me see here. Karen asked how to rewatch the video, and it was good, wasn't it? Thank you, Karen, for the compliment to David. And that is at pcmg.ucanr.org. And that's We'll probably cover that one more time. Someone asked you, David, there are more, and you still have 45 people still on this webinar listening to your answers. Does maturity date mean when the tomatoes are ready to harvest?
Yes, that's traditionally what that means, is when you got to realize a lot of these tomatoes are going to produce longer than that maturity rate, right? So they're going to first be mature, and then most of these indeterminate varieties will produce right up until a frost. So that's when they're ready to harvest. Your first are ready to harvest, and they'll generally produce right up till harvest. Then a determinate variety, most of the fruit will come bare right at the time of maturity, but you'll generally get some additional production also after that. So that's traditionally when the first fruit is available to harvest. Yes.
Thank you. Let's see, one more question. No. That sounds like it's the last one. This is okay. The way the person wrote the question. One more question. When the farmers spray in the spring, in parentheses, we are farmers, so I'm not pointing fingers, I have noticed that my tomato plants curl up on the edges for a while. Is that farm spray perhaps that floated?
Well, it could be. I'm not sure. It depends on where you're at. When a farmer sprayed, and I worked in agriculture for 38 years, so I'm pretty familiar with farmers that spray. When you make an application of various pesticides, and one of the things that can happen is you can get drift through wind or even an inversion, depending on when they spray. And most of the time they don't spray in the wind, but it could be, yeah, you could get some drift, and it could be the curling of the leaves could be caused by that. It just, you know, depends on what they're spraying with, really. And I mean, generally most farmers are pretty cautious about what they're spraying with, you know, sensitive materials but it could be, yes.
Okay. I'm going to put two questions together. These are from Karen and Colleen. They both have to do with mulching. One is generic question. I'm mulching with leaves, any challenge? And the other question is, what about oak leaves? We might have a lot of oak leaves in this area for mulch.
Yeah, I mean, you can use oak leaves I like to use put the leaves in compost and use that compost and just kind of mulch with that. That's a good strategy. Yeah, absolutely.
Here's a good general question, I think, for tomatoes and everything. Any recommendation on where to buy drip irrigation?
I mean, there's a lot of sources. I think most of the nurseries have you know, drip irrigation supplies available. I mean, readily available. But I mean, here in Auburn, I mean, we're not supposed to recommend, you know, specific places. So, but I personally, where I get mine is, it's what I have to ask my wife actually. I get it at Sierra Pipe. That's what it's called. Sierra Pipe in Auburn. That's a good place to go. But there's a lot of places that have a lot of different options for drip irrigation material, and you'll get that material, and you got to kind of calculate it out and understand there's different emitters. That's kind of a separate class, but there's different emitters. They emit a different amount. Some of them are half gallon per hour. Some of them are a gallon. So you got to kind of calculate that out. But those people at those stores will help you out with that a lot also. And we may have a workshop at some point on irrigation too, which would be a good idea to do.
Oh, that would be great. Here's
Yeah.
one question really appropriate for our area. My tomatoes are near an oak tree and it drops tons of acorns. Will they cause disease? They're hard to get rid of.
I don't think they're gonna, you know, the biggest problem you might have from that oak tree is shade on they might give you too much shade and you might not get that much production, but I don't think the oak nuts are going to cause that much trouble.
Okay. Well, you know, we've been going for about an hour and our time is up. Lots of comments here in the chat, David, about great presentation, and I agree with that. So I'd like to remind you all that the links and the handouts to this workshop will soon be available at pcmg.ucanr.org. Under upcoming events, you can check out any future virtual workshops that we're going to be offering as well. You also on that site can click on Ask a Master Gardener. So if you have questions about tomatoes or anything else, you can use that as well. Our next workshop is Saturday, February 27th, and it's on planning your summer garden. It's a perfect follow-up to David's presentation today. Please remember, if you're in a different county or another area in the world, you want to consult your local Master Gardener program or other experts about geographic or climatic differences in the garden. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Great job, David. We hope to see you at our next presentation. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Bye.
There we go.